Ma'am, drop the item and keep your hands where I can see them. The voice cut clean through the low hum of checkout scanners and quiet conversations, sharp enough to make 3 people in line turn at once. And in the reflection of the polished tile floor, the overhead lights seemed to freeze mid-glow, as if the entire store had paused just to watch what would happen next. Alana Brooks didn't move right away, not because she hadn't heard him, but because she had, and she understood exactly what that tone meant. The kind that didn't ask questions, the kind that had already decided the answer. And slowly, almost deliberately, she turned her head, not her body, just enough to meet the officer's eyes over her shoulder, her hand still resting lightly on the edge of the small plastic shopping basket beside her cart. A gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a box of cereal tucked neatly inside like any ordinary purchase on any ordinary afternoon. "I think you've got the wrong person," she said, her voice calm, even, not raised, not defensive, just steady. "The way you speak when you know something the other person doesn't yet realize they've missed." Officer Tyler Hayes stepped closer, the soft rubber soles of his boots whispering against the floor, his posture straight, controlled, his expression set in that tight, professional mask that left no room for doubt, or correction, or second thoughts. And behind him, another officer lingered near the automatic doors, one hand resting casually near his radio, eyes scanning the scene as if this were already a closed case. "We received a report," Hayes replied, his voice lower now, but no less firm. "Unpaid merchandise, concealed before reaching the register." And the words hung there, clinical, procedural, stripping away the ordinary details of milk and bread and replacing them with something heavier, something colder. A woman a few feet away shifted her purse closer to her side. A man in a baseball cap pulled out his phone without trying to hide it, the faint red dot of recording blinking to life. And somewhere near the end of the aisle, a child stopped mid-sentence, sensing the tension the way children always do, without needing to understand it. Alana exhaled slowly, not a sigh, just a measured breath, the kind that steadies your center, and she lifted her hands slightly, palms open, not in surrender, not in fear, just visible, deliberate, a silent signal that she wasn't going to escalate what didn't need escalating. And yet the space between them tightened anyway, as if the air itself had drawn a line that neither of them could step back from. "I paid," she said, nodding faintly toward the receipt folded once, twice, tucked just inside the top of her bag, the paper edge barely visible. And for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Hayes's face. Not doubt exactly, but recognition of a variable that didn't fit cleanly into the version of events he'd already assembled in his mind. And then it was gone, replaced again by procedure. "We'll sort that out," he said, reaching for the cuffs at his belt with a motion so practiced it barely registered as a decision, more like a continuation of momentum. And the faint metallic click as they shifted in his hand was enough to draw another wave of attention from the crowd, a ripple of whispers, low, indistinct, but unmistakably there. Alana's gaze dropped for a moment, not to the cuffs, not to the floor, but to his hands, steady, controlled, and then back to his face, her expression unchanged, composed in a way that didn't match the situation, not because she didn't understand it, but because she understood it too well. "Officer," she said, and there was something different in the way she said it now, not louder, not sharper, just precise, as if the word itself carried weight he hadn't noticed yet. "You're making a mistake." And the sentence landed softly, without force, without accusation, but it didn't dissipate. It stayed, lingering in the narrow space between them like something waiting to be acknowledged. Hayes didn't respond right away, his jaw tightening just enough to show the strain beneath the surface of control. And behind him, the second officer shifted his stance, glancing briefly at the small cluster of onlookers, the phones, the eyes, the quiet anticipation that had replaced the store's earlier normalcy. "Turn around," Hayes said finally. The words clipped, final, and the moment stretched, thin and fragile, as Alana held his gaze for one more second, then nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, before turning slowly, carefully, her movements measured, deliberate, as if she were guiding the pace of the scene rather than reacting to it. And when the cool metal touched her wrist, the sound it made was soft, almost insignificant. But in the stillness of that aisle, It echoed louder than it should have. A single, unmistakable click that seemed to settle over everything like a verdict not yet tested. Somewhere behind them, the child asked a quiet question no one answered. The phone camera tilted for a better angle, and under the bright, unblinking lights, Alana Brooks stood perfectly still, her hands now secured, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her eyes forward, as if she were seeing something beyond the rows of shelves and the watching crowd, something further down the line that no one else in that moment could yet see. "Walk," Hayes said quietly, not loud enough to draw more attention, but firm enough that it carried weight, and the word moved things forward again, breaking the fragile stillness that had settled over the aisle as Alana took her first step, then another, the plastic bag rustling softly at her side, while the faint hum of refrigeration units filled the silence no one else seemed willing to speak into. The automatic doors at the front of the store slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, letting in a strip of late afternoon light that stretched across the floor like a boundary between two different worlds, inside and out, ordinary and something else entirely. And as they crossed that line, the temperature shifted just enough to be noticed, a subtle coolness carried by the breeze that brushed against her face, lifting a loose strand of hair near her temple. Behind them, the murmurs followed, low and speculative, the kind that built stories before facts had time to catch up, and the red recording light from at least two phones remained steady, tracking each movement as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond this moment. "Step to the curb," the second officer said, gesturing toward the marked patrol vehicle parked at an angle near the entrance, its engine idling with a low, constant vibration that hummed through the pavement, and Alana complied without hesitation, her movements controlled, measured, the cuffs resting against her wrists not as a weight, but as a detail she had already accounted for. Hayes stayed close enough that he could hear the even rhythm of her breathing, something that did not match the tension of the situation, and that discrepancy lingered in the back of his mind, subtle but persistent, like a note slightly out of tune. "Do you have identification on you?" he asked, his tone shifting just enough to suggest the next step in a process he had followed countless times before, and for the first time since the interaction began. Alana allowed a faint pause before answering. Not long, not dramatic, just a fraction of a second where she seemed to consider something beyond the question itself. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "In my bag," and she nodded slightly toward it, the small motion deliberate, careful, as if she understood exactly how each gesture would be interpreted. Hayes reached for the bag, unzipping it with a controlled motion, his eyes scanning the contents quickly, methodically: milk, bread, cereal, a folded receipt, a wallet tucked neatly against the side, and he pulled it free, opening it just enough to locate the identification card inside, the edges worn slightly from use, but otherwise unremarkable, and as he slid it out, the light caught the surface in a way that forced him to angle it for a clearer view. For a moment, he focused on the name, Alana Brooks, reading it once, then again, something about it settling into place without fully connecting, and then his attention shifted to the rest, the issuing department, the insignia, the details that did not align with the narrative he had constructed just minutes earlier, and the shift was subtle, almost invisible, a tightening at the corner of his eyes, a slight pause in the movement of his hands. But it was there. The second officer leaned in slightly, glancing at the card, then back at Hayes, his expression unreadable but attentive, waiting, and the space between them filled with a quiet that felt different from before, less certain, less fixed. "This is," Hayes began, but the sentence did not finish, not because he could not find the words, but because the words he had expected no longer fit, and Alana watched him, not with satisfaction, not with challenge, but with a calm that remained unchanged, as if she had been here before, not in this exact place, not with these exact people, but in this kind of moment, where perception lagged behind reality. "You can verify it," she said softly, her tone neither defensive nor assertive, just factual, and she tilted her head slightly toward the patrol car, toward the radio that crackled faintly with distant transmissions, fragments of other calls, other situations unfolding in parallel. Hayes exhaled, a controlled release of breath that did little to ease the tension building beneath the surface, and he stepped toward the vehicle, the card still in his hand, the weight of it now different, heavier, not because of what it was, but because of what it implied. And as he reached for the radio, the familiar texture of the microphone grounding him in procedure, in protocol, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second before pressing the button. The static cutting through the air like a thin line of interference between what he thought he knew and what he was about to confirm. Behind him, Alana stood at the curb, the late afternoon light catching the edge of her profile, her posture straight, her gaze forward, not on him, not on the officers, but somewhere just beyond, as if she were already seeing the moment after this one, the point where everything would have to be reevaluated, and the quiet confidence in that stillness did not go unnoticed, even if it was not yet fully understood. The radio crackled once, twice, a burst of static cutting through the low hum of the patrol car's engine, and Hayes lifted the microphone closer to his mouth, his thumb hovering over the transmit button for just a fraction longer than it should have, as if something in him needed that extra second to recalibrate, to align what he was about to say with the certainty he had felt only moments earlier. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, he said finally, his voice controlled, professional, but carrying a faint edge that had not been there before, requesting verification on an identification, and the words moved out into the air, into the system, into something larger than the narrow scene at the curb, something that did not rely on assumption or instinct but on record and fact. A brief pause followed, filled only by the distant murmur of other transmissions bleeding through the channel, fragments of unrelated calls, numbers, locations, voices layered over each other in a constant flow, and Hayes glanced down at the card again, his eyes tracing the printed details with more care this time, as if each line held a piece of a puzzle he had assembled too quickly. Behind him, the second officer shifted his weight, his gaze moving from Hayes to Alana and back again, the earlier certainty in his posture softening into something more cautious, more observant. Alana remained still at the curb, her hands secured but relaxed, her shoulders level, her breathing even, and there was a quiet in the way she stood that did not match the tension around her, not passive, not submissive, but grounded, as if she were anchored to something deeper than the moment unfolding on the surface. "Go ahead, Unit 12, dispatch replied, the voice clear now, steady, neutral, and Hayes read off the name, the identification number, each detail, articulated carefully, deliberately, the way you do when you know precision matters more than speed. Another pause followed, longer this time, and in that space, the world seemed to narrow again, the sounds of the parking lot fading into a distant backdrop, the focus tightening around the radio, the card, the space between expectation and confirmation. A car door slammed somewhere across the lot. A shopping cart rattled against a metal corral, the everyday noise continuing just beyond the edge of what felt like a suspended moment. Hayes swallowed once, subtly, his grip on the microphone adjusting slightly, and for the first time since the interaction began, there was something in his expression that resembled uncertainty, not visible enough to draw attention from a distance, but present, real. "Unit 12, stand by," dispatch said, and the words carried a weight that settled into the space between them, stretching the moment further, drawing it out, forcing everything to remain unresolved just a little longer. Hayes lowered the microphone slightly, not releasing it, just easing his thumb off the button, his eyes drifting once more to Alana, who had not moved, had not shifted, had not offered anything beyond the same steady presence she had held from the beginning. She met his gaze briefly, not challenging, not avoiding, just meeting it, and in that brief connection, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need words to exist, a recognition that the moment was changing, even if the outcome had not yet been spoken aloud. The second officer cleared his throat quietly, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and he stepped half a pace closer, lowering his voice just enough that it would not carry beyond the immediate space. "You think it is legit?" he asked, not fully committing to the question, leaving it open, tentative. Hayes did not answer right away, his attention still fixed on the card, on the details that now felt heavier, more significant, and then he exhaled slowly, a measured breath that suggested a shift not yet fully acknowledged. "We will confirm," he said, the words careful, neutral, but lacking the earlier certainty that had driven his actions. The radio crackled again, sharper this time, pulling his focus back instantly, his thumb pressing down without hesitation, the response immediate. Unit 12, verification complete. Dispatch began, the tone unchanged, but the effect immediate, like a switch flipping somewhere unseen. Identification matches. Captain Alana Brooks, active status, currently off duty, and the words landed clean, precise, undeniable, cutting through the assumptions that had filled the space just moments before. Hayes did not move at first, the microphone still raised, the card still in his other hand, and for a brief second, everything seemed to hold. The air, the light, the quiet presence of the small crowd that had not yet dispersed, all of it suspended on the edge of that confirmation. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his posture shifted, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to register, his grip on the microphone loosening as he lowered it, and his eyes lifted, meeting Alana's again, this time with something different behind them, something that had not been there before. Not quite regret, not fully understanding, but a recognition that the situation in front of him was no longer what he had believed it to be. The second officer's gaze dropped to the ground for a moment, then back up, his stance adjusting. The earlier readiness replaced by a quieter awareness, and the distance between them and Alana seemed to change without anyone physically moving. The invisible line redrawn by information rather than action. Alana remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held herself now, not more assertive, not more forceful, just present in a way that carried its own authority, the kind that did not need to be announced because it existed regardless of whether it was acknowledged. Hayes took a step forward, slow, deliberate, the card still in his hand, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might speak, might offer something to bridge the gap that had formed between what had happened and what had now been confirmed, but the words did not come immediately, held back by the weight of the realization settling in, and the quiet that followed was different from the ones before, no longer built on assumption or tension, but on the undeniable presence of truth that had finally surfaced. Hayes stood there for a moment longer than protocol allowed, the radio now silent in his hand, the confirmation still echoing in his mind as if it needed time to fully settle into place, and the weight of the identification card between his fingers seemed heavier now, not because of the material, but because of everything it represented, everything it had just corrected. The late afternoon sun shifted slightly, casting a longer shadow from the patrol car across the pavement, and in that stretch of light and shadow, the scene felt different, no longer charged by accusation, but held in a quieter, more complicated tension. He stepped closer, each movement slower, more deliberate than before, and the faint sound of gravel beneath his boots marked the distance closing between them, while Alana remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, not fixed on him, but aware of him, aware of everything. Captain Brooks, Hayes said, and this time the title came first, not as an afterthought, not as a correction, but as an acknowledgement, and the words carried a different tone, one that replaced certainty with something more measured, more careful. There seems to have been a misunderstanding, and even as he spoke, it was clear that the sentence did not fully capture what had happened, that it softened something sharper, something more significant, but it was the language he reached for, the language that kept things within the boundaries of procedure. The second officer shifted beside him, his stance less rigid now, his eyes no longer scanning for threat, but watching, waiting, as if taking cues from a situation that had shifted beyond the script he had expected to follow. Hayes reached toward the cuffs, his movements controlled, precise, and there was a brief pause before he acted, not hesitation exactly, but a moment of recognition, of awareness of the line he had crossed without realizing it at the time, and then the soft metallic clicks sounded again, this time releasing rather than securing, the pressure easing from Alana's wrists as the cuffs opened and fell away. The marks left behind were faint but visible, a subtle imprint against her skin, and for a second, Hayes noticed them, really noticed them, not as a detail in a process, but as something real, something that remained after the action itself was undone. Alana lowered her hand slowly, rubbing one wrist lightly with the other, not dramatically, not to draw attention, just enough to restore feeling. And then she let them rest at her sides, her posture still composed, still grounded, as if nothing about her needed to shift even though everything around her had. Hayes extended the identification card toward her, his hand steady but not as firm as before, and she accepted it with a small nod, her fingers brushing briefly against the edge of the card before she slid it back into her wallet, the motion smooth, practiced, familiar. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching between them, filled with the low idle of the patrol car engine, the distant sound of another car pulling into the lot, the faint murmur of voices from the store entrance where a few onlookers still lingered, their attention not fully released. I followed the report, Hayes said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain, as if the words needed to find their way carefully. We received a call, description matched, and I acted on it. And the explanation hung there, factual, procedural, but incomplete, because it did not address the assumptions that had filled the gaps, the speed with which certainty had formed before verification had a chance to intervene. Alana looked at him then, directly, her expression calm, not accusatory, not dismissive, just present, and there was something in her gaze that held steady, something that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. "You acted fast," she said, her tone even, and the sentence was simple, but it carried weight, not in what it said outright, but in what it left unsaid, the space between the words where meaning settled. Hayes nodded slightly, the motion small, acknowledging, but not resolving, and he glanced briefly toward the second officer, then back to Alana, as if searching for something to bridge the distance that had formed, something that would place the moment back into a structure he understood. "If there is anything further we need to do to correct this," he began, the phrase formal, almost rehearsed, but it faltered slightly before completing, because the correction was not as simple as paperwork or protocol, not as contained as a report could make it. Alana shook her head once, a small, controlled movement. "The correction starts earlier than that," she said, her voice still calm, still measured, and she let the words settle without elaborating, without pressing, leaving them where they were, clear enough to be understood, open enough to be considered. The second officer shifted again, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to neutral, his posture adjusting as if recalibrating to a situation that no longer required the stance he had brought into it. A breeze moved through the lot, light but noticeable, carrying with it the faint scent of asphalt warmed by the sun, and for a moment, everything felt quieter, not empty, but reset, as if the scene had reached a point where something had been revealed that could not be unseen. Hayes straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a different kind of alignment, not rigid, not defensive, but aware, and he gave a small nod, more to himself than to anyone else, as if acknowledging a shift that did not need to be spoken aloud. Alana adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, the movement simple, ordinary, and yet it marked a transition, a return to something beyond the moment that had just unfolded, and she glanced once toward the store, then back at the officers, her expression unchanged, steady, composed. The distance between them remained, not physical, but understood, defined now not by authority or assumption, but by the quiet recognition of what had happened and what it meant. And as the engine of the patrol car continued its low, steady hum, the scene settled into a silence that felt different from before, not tense, not suspended, but reflective, as if everything that needed to be said had already been placed into the space between them, waiting to be carried forward in whatever came next. Alana shifted her weight slightly, the strap of her bag resting more securely against her shoulder as the moment began to loosen its grip on the space around them. But not entirely, because something still lingered in the air, something unfinished that could not simply be dismissed with the removal of handcuffs or the return of an identification card. Hayes glanced once toward the small cluster of onlookers near the entrance, noticing how a few phones were still raised, still recording, their lenses capturing not just what had happened, but what would follow, and that awareness settled into him with a quiet pressure that had not been there before. "We should clear the area," the second officer murmured, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if unsure whether he was speaking out of protocol or discomfort, and Hayes gave a short nod, stepping half a pace back, his presence no longer positioned to control, but to reassess. "All right, folks, everything is handled here," he called out, his tone measured, attempting to restore a sense of normalcy that felt slightly out of reach. "You can go ahead and move along." And some did, slowly, reluctantly, while others lingered a moment longer, curiosity not yet satisfied, before finally turning away, the quiet buzz of conversation rising again as the tension dispersed into fragments. Alana watched this without expression, not because it did not matter, but because she understood how quickly moments like this dissolved into something else for everyone except the person standing in the center of it. Hayes turned back to her, his posture more contained now, less certain of its authority, and for a brief second, he seemed to search for the right place to stand, not physically, but in the space of what came next. "Captain," he began again, the title steadier this time, more intentional. "I am going to document the interaction." And he gestured lightly toward the patrol car, toward the report that would eventually reduce the entire moment into lines of text, timestamps, descriptions, standard procedure. He added, though the phrase sounded thinner. Now, less capable of holding the weight it usually carried. Alana nodded once, acknowledging, but her eyes remained on him, steady, observant, and there was a quiet expectation there, not of apology, not of explanation, but of something more precise. "Make sure you include everything," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, but clear, and the words settled into the space between them with a kind of finality that did not need emphasis. Hayes hesitated, just for a moment, then nodded again. Slower this time, understanding what she meant without needing further clarification, the second officer shifted his stance once more, his hands resting loosely at his sides now, no longer positioned near his belt, and he glanced toward Alana briefly, then away, as if unsure where to place his attention. A car passed slowly through the lot, its tires rolling over the asphalt with a soft, steady sound, and the normal rhythm of the environment began to return, piece by piece. Carts moving, doors opening and closing, voices blending back into the background. Hayes reached into the front seat of the patrol car, pulling out a small notepad, the paper crisp, untouched, and he clicked his pen once, the sound sharp in the quiet, before pausing again, looking down at the blank page as if it required more than ink to capture what had just occurred. Alana noticed the pause, the slight tightening in his grip, and for a second, the scene shifted inward, from public to personal, from action to reflection. "You had time to check," she said, not accusing, not raising her voice, just stating it. And Hayes looked up, meeting her gaze, the words landing with a clarity that cut through the structure of procedure. "I followed the description," he replied, but even as he said it, the sentence felt incomplete, insufficient, and he stopped there, letting the rest remain unspoken. Alana held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the gap between what was done and what could have been done differently. "Descriptions are not always the whole picture," she said quietly, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than a longer explanation could have, settling into the space where assumption had once filled in the blanks. Hayes exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the slight movement of his shoulders, and he looked down at the notepad again, beginning to write, each word deliberate, each line measured, as if he understood now that accuracy mattered in a way that extended beyond the report itself. The second officer stepped back toward the car, giving them space, his earlier presence receding into the background, and the distance allowed the moment to narrow again. Focusing on the exchange that mattered, Alana adjusted her sleeve slightly, covering the faint marks on her wrist, not hiding them, just returning herself to a state that felt like her own, and she glanced once more toward the store entrance, where the last of the onlookers had dispersed, the scene returning to its ordinary rhythm as if nothing significant had occurred. Hayes finished a line, then paused, his pen hovering above the page, and he looked up again, something shifting behind his eyes, something quieter, more internal. "I will include that," he said, referring not just to her words, but to the understanding behind them, and Alana gave a small nod, accepting, not as resolution, but as a step. The sun dipped slightly lower, the lights softening across the lot, and in that change, the moment settled into something less immediate, but no less real, a quiet imprint left behind, not in the space itself, but in the way it had been experienced, and as the pen moved again across the page, the sound of it scratching lightly against the paper, it marked not just the documentation of an event, but the beginning of something that would remain with both of them long after the scene had faded from view. The pen continued moving across the page, each stroke steady but slower than before, as if Hayes was no longer just recording what had happened, but trying to understand it while it was still fresh. While the details had not yet been reduced to routine language, and the faint scratching sound seemed louder in the quiet that had settled between them, Alana watched for a moment, not the words themselves but the way he wrote them, the pauses, the slight hesitations that interrupted what should have been a fluid process, and she recognized that rhythm. The moment when someone begins to question not just the outcome but the path that led there. A shopping cart rolled past a few yards away, pushed by a man who glanced once in their direction before continuing on, his footsteps fading into the background, and the ordinary movement of the parking lot returned in pieces, small fragments of normalcy that contrasted with the weight still hanging in the air. "You have been on the job long," Alana said after a moment, her voice calm, not probing, just conversational in a way that shifted the tone slightly, and Hayes looked up from the notepad, caught off guard by the question, his brow tightening briefly as he recalibrated. 8 years, he answered, then added, "Just over 8. As if the exact number mattered in this context, as if it anchored him to something familiar. Alana nodded once, her gaze steady. "That is enough time to know the difference between a report and a pattern," she said, and the words landed softly, not confrontational, but they carried a precision that cut deeper than volume ever could. Hayes did not respond immediately, his eyes drifting back to the page, but he did not write, the pen hovering just above the paper as if the next line required more than recollection, as if it required acknowledgement. The second officer leaned lightly against the side of the patrol car now, his posture relaxed in appearance but attentive in reality, his eyes moving between them, absorbing the exchange without interrupting, sensing that something more important than procedure was unfolding. "We get calls, we respond," Hayes said after a moment, his tone quieter, less rigid, as if he were explaining something he had always accepted without question. "We are trained to act on what we are given." And the statement was true, factual, but it sat there incomplete, lacking the part that had not been considered until now. Alana tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "You are trained to verify as well," she replied, her voice still even, and the simplicity of the correction left little room for deflection. Hayes exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering a fraction, and he looked out across the lot for a second, as if searching for something beyond the immediate moment, something that might place it into a larger context he could navigate. "It does not always happen that way," he said, and this time there was no attempt to make the sentence sound stronger than it was, no effort to reinforce certainty where it no longer fully existed. Alana let the silence sit for a beat, allowing his words to settle, not rushing to fill the space, and when she spoke again, her tone remained measured, grounded. "That is when it matters most," she said, and the words did not accuse, did not demand, but they held their place firmly, as if they belonged there. Hayes nodded slowly, the motion more deliberate now, not just acknowledgement but acceptance of a point he could not easily dismiss, and he looked back down at the notepad, writing again, this time with a different pace, each word chosen with more care, more intention, as if the act of writing had shifted from routine to responsibility. The second officer straightened slightly, pushing himself off the car, and he glanced toward the store entrance where the flow of customers had returned to normal, then back to Alana, his expression thoughtful, quieter than before. "You were calm the whole time," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard, and Alana turned her gaze toward him briefly, a faint hint of something softer passing through her expression, not quite a smile, but close. "Panic does not help anyone see clearly," she said, and the statement was simple, but it carried an understanding that extended beyond the moment, beyond the parking lot, into something broader. Hayes paused again, pen still, and he looked up at her, this time not as someone trying to resolve a situation, but as someone trying to learn from it, the shift subtle but real. "You could have said something sooner," he said, And the words were not defensive, not accusatory, just a reflection of what he now saw as a missed opportunity to change the course earlier. Alana met his gaze without hesitation, her voice steady as she answered, "I did." And she let that sit there, letting him trace back through the moment, through her calm statement in the aisle, through the way she had told him he was making a mistake, through the space where he had chosen not to pause. Hayes looked down again, the realization settling in with a quiet weight, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but persistent, and he nodded once more, this time slower, more inward. The sun dipped a little lower, casting longer shadows across the pavement, stretching the shapes of the patrol car and the three figures standing beside it. And in that shifting light, the moment felt less immediate but more lasting, as if it had moved from something happening into something. Understood. Alana adjusted her grip on the strap of her bag again, a small, practical movement, and she glanced once toward the direction of the store, then back at Hayes, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. Hayes finished the last line on the page, then closed the notepad, the soft snap of it marking the end of the report, but not the end of what it represented. And he held it there for a second before lowering his hand, looking at her with a quiet seriousness that had not been there. When this began, a recognition that this moment, simple on the surface, had shifted something beneath it, something that would not be easily written away. The quiet that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had been placed there that none of them could ignore anymore. And for a moment, no one moved. Not because they were unsure what to do next, but because what had just settled between them did not require immediate action. It required recognition. Hayes shifted the notepad in his hand, then slid it back into the front seat of the patrol car. His movements slower now, less automatic, as if each action needed to pass through a new filter before it was carried out. And when he straightened again, he did not step forward, did not close the distance the way he had at the beginning. Instead, he stayed where he was, allowing space to exist where control once had. Alana noticed that, the subtle adjustment, the way he no longer occupied the moment the same way, and she let out a quiet breath, not relief, not tension, just a natural release. Her shoulders settling slightly as the last of the immediate pressure faded, a breeze moved again across the lot, lifting a loose receipt from near the curb and sending it skimming lightly across the pavement before it caught against a tire. And the small, ordinary motion seemed to underline how quickly the world continued, how little it paused for moments like this, even when they changed something inside the people standing in them. "You said 8 years, Alana spoke again, her tone steady, not pressing, just continuing the thread she had already begun, and Hayes nodded once, his gaze returning to her with a quiet attentiveness that had not been there earlier. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, the formality coming back, but different now, not imposed, not automatic, but chosen, and she held his gaze for a moment before speaking again. "That is long enough to start noticing which calls repeat themselves," she said, and the sentence did not accuse, did not assign blame, but it pointed towards something larger than this single moment, something that extended beyond the parking lot, beyond the report now sitting. Closed in the patrol car, Hayes did not answer right away, his eyes shifting slightly as if tracing through memories, calls, situations that had once felt separate but now seemed connected in a way he had not fully considered, and the silence stretched just long enough to show that he was thinking, not reacting. "Some do," he admitted quietly, the words measured, careful, as if he was stepping into unfamiliar ground. And the second officer glanced toward him briefly, surprised not by what was said, but by the way it was said, without defense, without the usual certainty that wrapped around statements like that. Alana gave a small nod, acknowledging the honesty, and her gaze softened just slightly, not in sympathy, but in recognition of the shift taking place. "Patterns do not announce themselves," she continued, her voice calm, steady. "They show up in the same places, with the same assumptions, until someone stops long enough to see them." And she let the words settle, not pushing them further, not explaining beyond what was necessary. Hayes exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering another fraction, and he looked out across the parking lot again. But this time it felt different, not like he was searching for something to say, but like he was seeing something he had not fully seen before. The ordinary flow of people, cars, movement, all of it carrying layers he had not paused to consider. The second officer shifted his stance again, stepping slightly closer, but still remaining quiet, his presence no longer part of an active situation, but part of the reflection that followed it. "It is not always clear in the moment," Hayes said after a few seconds, his voice quieter, less certain, and the statement was not an excuse, not anymore. It was an observation, something he was realizing as he spoke it. Alana tilted her head slightly, considering his words, then nodded once. "That is why the moment matters," she replied, and the sentence was simple, but it carried weight, the kind that did not need emphasis to be understood. Hayes looked back at her, and for a brief second, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not authority, not defensiveness, but awareness, a recognition that what had happened was not just a situation resolved, but a moment that revealed something about how easily things could go in the wrong direction without pause. A car horn sounded faintly in the distance, someone calling out across the lot, the normal rhythm of the world continuing uninterrupted, and yet for the three of them, the space still held the echo of what had shifted. Alana adjusted the strap of her bag once more, the motion small, practical, and she glanced briefly toward the store, then back at Hayes, her expression steady, unchanged in its calm, and there was no urgency in her movement, no rush to leave, just a quiet readiness. Hayes straightened slightly, not in a return to authority, but in a kind of internal alignment, and he gave a small nod, not as a formal gesture, but as an acknowledgement of something understood, something he would carry forward even after this moment ended. The second officer looked between them, then toward the patrol car, then back again, as if recognizing that what had just taken place was not something that fit neatly into procedure, not something that could be closed with a simple line in a report. And as the late afternoon light continued to soften, stretching shadows across the pavement and blending the edges of everything into a quieter tone, the moment settled into something deeper than resolution, something that would remain, not spoken, not written fully, but present in the way each of them would move through the next call, the next decision, the next moment where a pause could change everything. The light shifted again, softer now, stretching longer across the pavement as the day leaned toward evening. And in that quiet transition, something inside the moment began to deepen rather than fade, as if what had already been said was only the surface of something still unfolding. Hayes rested his hand lightly against the side of the patrol car, not leaning, just grounding himself there, his eyes moving briefly toward the reflection in the window, catching a glimpse of his own posture, the uniform, the badge, all the symbols that had felt so certain earlier, now carrying a different kind of weight. Alana followed that glance without turning her head, noticing the reflection too, the way the glass held both of them in the same frame, no longer separated by distance or assumption, just two figures standing in the same light, and for a moment, the silence between them felt less like tension and more like space for something to be understood. "Do you know what people remember?" she said quietly, her voice steady, not directed as a challenge, but as a question that carried its own answer, and Hayes looked back at her, his expression attentive, no longer guarded, just present. "They remember how a moment felt," she continued, her gaze steady. "Not the report, not the explanation, just the feeling of it." And the words settled into the space with a quiet certainty that did not need to be reinforced. Hayes nodded slowly, the motion thoughtful, as if he was tracing back through the moment again, not the sequence of actions, but the way it must have looked, the way it must have felt from her side of it, from the perspective he had not taken the time to see at first. The second officer shifted slightly, his gaze lowering for a brief second before lifting again, the realization not his alone, but shared in the quiet understanding that had grown between them. A car door closed somewhere behind them, the sound echoing lightly across the lot, followed by the faint beep of a vehicle locking. Ordinary sounds that now seemed to carry more presence, more clarity, as if everything had sharpened in the aftermath of what had happened. "I cannot change how that started," Hayes said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less anchored in certainty and more in reflection, "but I can change what I do with it." And the sentence was simple, but it carried intention, not as a promise spoken outwardly, but as something forming internally, something that would influence what came next beyond this moment. Alana watched him for a second, measuring the words not by their structure but by the weight behind them, and she gave a small nod, not approving, not dismissing, just acknowledging that something real had shifted. "That is where it matters," she replied. Her tone even, and the exchange did not feel like resolution, not yet, but it felt like movement, like a step taken in a direction that had not been visible at the beginning. Hayes glanced toward the store again, then back at her, and for the first time, there was no need to reassert control, no need to return to protocol, just a quiet understanding that the moment had already moved beyond that. "If you had not said anything," he said, almost thinking aloud, "I might not have stopped to look." Again, and the realization hung there, not as an admission of fault alone, but as recognition of how easily things could have continued on the same path without interruption. Alana met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, grounded. "That is why I said it," she answered, and there was no emphasis in her voice, no need for it. The meaning already clear. The second officer exhaled quietly, almost unnoticed, and he stepped back a fraction more, giving them space not because it was required, but because it felt appropriate, as if the conversation belonged to something larger than a routine interaction. Hayes nodded again, slower this time, the movement more internal than external, and he straightened slightly, not returning to the rigid posture from before, but finding a balance between presence and awareness, something that felt more aligned with what he now understood. The late afternoon light dipped lower, softening the edges of everything, blending shadows into longer lines across the asphalt, and the scene, once sharp with tension, now held a different kind of clarity, one that did not demand attention but remained quietly visible. Alana adjusted her bag once more, her movements calm, unhurried, and she glanced briefly toward the direction she had been heading before all of this began, then back at Hayes, her expression unchanged, steady, composed, as if she had carried that same presence through the entire moment without needing it to shift. Hayes followed her glance, then looked back at her, and for a second, it seemed as though he might say something more, something that would attempt to close the space fully, but he stopped, recognizing that not everything needed to be said out loud to be understood. The second officer opened the patrol car door slightly, then paused, waiting, not moving forward without direction, and the small gesture reflected the shift that had taken place, a subtle change in how the moment was being held. The air cooled just enough to be noticed as the sun continued its descent, and in that cooling, the moment settled further, not fading, but grounding itself into something that would remain, carried quietly beyond the boundaries of this parking lot, beyond the lines of any report, into the way each of them would see the next moment when it arrived. And as Hayes let his hand fall from the side of the car, stepping back just enough to clear the space in front of her, the path ahead no longer blocked. The meaning of that movement did not need explanation. It was understood in the stillness that followed. For a moment, no one spoke, and the quiet that followed did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt deliberate, like a space being held open for a decision that did not need to be rushed, and Alana shifted her weight slightly forward, her foot moving just enough to signal intention, not urgency, just direction. Hayes noticed it immediately, the subtle change in posture, the way her body aligned toward the path ahead, and he stepped back another inch without thinking, clearing the space fully this time, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, and the movement was small, almost invisible, but it carried more meaning than anything he had said. The second officer glanced between them, then toward the open stretch of pavement leading away from the patrol car, and he followed Hayes's lead, stepping aside. As well, his stance no longer forming a barrier, just presence, quiet and observant. Alana took one step forward, then another, her pace steady, unhurried, the soft sound of her shoes against the asphalt blending into the background noise of the lot. And for a brief second, the moment seemed to return to something ordinary, a woman walking away from a store with groceries. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet the weight of what had just occurred remained, carried not in the scene, but in the way each of them stood within it. Hayes watched her for a second, his gaze following the line of her movement, and something in him resisted letting the moment close without one more acknowledgement. Not procedural, not required, but necessary in a way he could not fully explain, and he spoke before the thought had fully formed. Captain Brooks, he called, his voice steady but quieter than before, not commanding, not urgent, just present, and Alana stopped, not abruptly, just enough to turn her head slightly, her gaze meeting his again across the few feet of distance. The late sunlight caught the edge of her profile, softening the lines of the moment, and she waited, not expecting, just allowing space for whatever needed to be said. Hayes took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to steady the words that followed, and for a second, the weight of them seemed to sit behind his teeth, waiting for the right form, the right shape, before being released. "I will make sure this is written the way it happened," he said, and the sentence was simple, but this time it did not sound like procedure. It sounded like intent, like something he was choosing to carry forward beyond this moment. And Alana held his gaze for a second longer, measuring the words not for their phrasing, but for their weight. She gave a small nod, the motion calm, acknowledging without amplifying, and then she turned back toward her path, taking another step, the rhythm of her movement resuming as if the pause had been part of it all along. The second officer let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, the sound quiet but noticeable in the stillness, and he glanced toward Hayes, his expression thoughtful, not questioning, just aware. Hayes remained where he was, his hands resting loosely at his sides now, no longer anchored to his belt, no longer positioned in readiness, and he watched her walk, the distance between them increasing one step at a time, each one marking the end of something and the beginning of something else he had not fully defined yet. A car pulled into a nearby space, the engine cutting off with a soft click, and a family stepped out, their voices light, unaware of what had just taken place a few yards away, and the normal rhythm of the world continued, unbroken, unmarked by the shift that had occurred. Alana reached the edge of the lot where the pavement met the sidewalk, and she paused for a brief second, not to look back, not to reconsider, but simply to adjust her grip on the bag, the plastic rustling softly as it settled more comfortably in her hand. And then she stepped up onto the curb, continuing forward without hesitation. Hayes turned slightly, his gaze following her until the angle no longer allowed it. And then he looked down at his hands, at the space where the notepad had been, at the absence of the certainty that had filled them earlier, and for a moment, he stood there in the quiet, the hum of the patrol car engine behind him, the fading warmth of the sun in front of him, and the awareness of something that would not be easily set aside. The second officer opened the patrol car door fully now, the hinge creaking softly, and he glanced back at Hayes, waiting, not for instruction, but for alignment, for the subtle signal of what came next. Hayes nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, and he stepped toward the car, but not with the same pace as before, not with the same automatic rhythm. Each step carrying a fraction more awareness, a fraction more weight, as if the ground beneath him had shifted slightly, and he was learning how to stand on it again. Behind them, the store doors slid open and closed, the steady flow of people continuing, the light dimming gradually as the sun lowered, and somewhere in that movement, in that ordinary continuation, the moment they had just lived through settled into something quieter, something that would not be visible to anyone passing by, but would remain, carried forward in the next decision, the next pause, the next time a voice said something that could either be heard or overlooked. And as Hayes reached for the driver's side door, his hand pausing for just a fraction before pulling it open, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of what had been learned, what had been seen, and what would not be unseen again. The patrol car door closed with a muted thud, sealing the quiet inside for a moment as Hayes settled into the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel without turning the key, the engine still idling from before, a low vibration humming through the frame. And he sat there longer than necessary, his gaze unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond the windshield where the last stretch of sunlight softened the edges of the lot. The second officer slid into the passenger seat, the fabric shifting as he adjusted, then glanced sideways, waiting, not pressing, just aware that something in the moment had not fully settled yet. "You good?" he asked after a beat, his voice low, not casual, not formal, just present. And Hayes did not answer right away, his fingers tightening slightly against the wheel before easing again, a small motion that revealed more than his silence did. "I missed it," Hayes said finally, the words quiet, almost more to himself than to anyone else. "And The admission did not carry defensiveness, did not try to explain itself. It just sat there, simple and direct. The second officer nodded once, slowly, understanding the weight behind those two words without needing them expanded, and he looked out through the windshield as well, watching the normal movement of people and cars as if seeing it through a slightly altered lens. Outside, Alana continued along the sidewalk, her figure moving steadily away, not hurried, not delayed, just consistent. And the distance between them grew until she blended into the rhythm of the street. Another person moving through the city, except she was not to them, not anymore. Hayes exhaled and reached forward, switching off the engine, and the sudden absence of the hum made the silence inside the car more defined, more present, and he leaned back slightly, his shoulders settling into the seat as if releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. "You heard what she said," the second officer added, not as a reminder, but as a continuation, and Hayes nodded, his eyes dropping briefly to the dashboard, then lifting again. "About patterns," Hayes replied, his voice steadier now, and he let the word linger, as if it had expanded in meaning. Since she spoke it, the second officer shifted in his seat, resting his arm against the door. "We get those calls a lot," he said, and there was no denial in it, no attempt to soften it, just a statement of fact, and Hayes nodded again, slower this time. "Yeah," he said, and then after a pause, "But that does not mean we get to stop looking." And the sentence carried a different tone, not learned from a manual, not repeated from training, but formed from what had just happened, shaped by it. The second officer glanced at him again, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, not surprise, but acknowledgement that something had shifted, something subtle but real. Outside, the light continued to fade, the sky moving toward a softer gray blue as the sun dipped lower, and the shadows stretched longer across the lot, blending into one another until the sharp lines from earlier softened into something less defined. Hayes reached for the notepad on the dashboard, opening it again, flipping back to the page he had just written, and he read over the lines in silence, his eyes moving slowly, carefully, as if each word carried more weight now than when he first wrote it. "You going to change anything?" the second officer asked, his tone neutral, not questioning, just curious, and Hayes paused, his pen hovering above the page again. The same hesitation as before, but different this time, not uncertainty about what to write, but about how to say it accurately. "Not change," Hayes said, his voice quiet, completed, and he added another line, slower than the rest, each word placed deliberately, not for the sake of detail, but for the sake of truth, and when he finished, he closed the notepad again, the soft snap marking something more final than before. The second officer nodded once, then leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the windshield again, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, just reflective, as if the conversation had already done what it needed to do. Hayes rested his hands on his knees now, not gripping, not bracing, just present, and he looked out at the lot one more time, the ordinary scene continuing as if nothing had happened. And yet he knew it had, not in a way that would make headlines, not in a way that would be remembered by the people who passed through it, but in a way that would stay with him, shaping the next decision, the next moment when instinct met responsibility. "Next time," the second officer said quietly, almost as a thought spoken aloud, and Hayes nodded before the sentence even finished, understanding it without needing the rest. "Next time," he echoed, and the words settled between them, not as a promise, not as a correction, but as a shift, something small, something internal, something that would not show on the outside, but would change the way the moment unfolded when it came again. Outside, a breeze moved through the lot, carrying the faint sound of traffic from the street beyond, blending into the quiet rhythm of the evening. And as Hayes reached forward and finally turned the key again, the engine coming back to life with a low, steady hum. The sound felt different, not louder, not stronger, just clearer, as if something in him had aligned with it in a way it had not before. And as the patrol car eased forward, pulling out of the space and into the flow of movement, the moment behind them did not disappear, it traveled with them, quiet, unseen, but present in every mile that followed. The patrol car merged into the slow evening traffic, the steady rhythm of red brake lights stretching ahead like a quiet pulse through the city, and Hayes kept both hands on the wheel, not tense, not relaxed, just present in a way that felt new, as if every small motion now carried a little more awareness than before. The second officer adjusted the radio volume slightly, lowering it, just enough that the distant chatter of other units became a background hum instead of a distraction, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, just reflective, holding the weight of what had already been said without needing to repeat it. A few blocks passed, the tires rolling over the asphalt in a steady, even sound, and Hayes slowed at a light, the red glow washing softly across the dashboard, illuminating the edges of his hands, the faint marks of where tension had once held tighter than it should have. He exhaled slowly, watching the crosswalk ahead as a pedestrian stepped through, a woman carrying 2 bags, moving carefully, deliberately, and for a second, the image overlapped in his mind with the moment from earlier, the same ordinary action, the same quiet movement, but seen now with a different clarity. "You ever think about how fast we decide?" Hayes said, his voice low, not directed outward so much as spoken into the space between them and the second officer glanced over briefly, then back to the road ahead. "It is part of the job," he replied, his tone neutral, but there was less certainty in it than before, less automatic confidence in the statement. Hayes nodded slightly, acknowledging that truth, but not stopping there. "Yeah," he said, then added after a pause, "but maybe it should not be the only part," and the light shifted to green. The soft click of it almost unnoticed as he pressed the accelerator and the car moved forward. Again, the city passed by in quiet layers, storefronts closing, streetlights beginning to flicker on one by one, casting small pools of light onto the sidewalks, and inside the car, the air felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just more intentional, as if each moment was being held with a little more care. The radio crackled again, a new call coming through, the voice clear, steady, describing a situation a few miles away, something routine, something familiar, and Hayes reached toward it, his fingers brushing the dial before pressing the button. "Unit 12, copy," he said, his tone professional, steady, but there was a pause after, just a fraction of a second longer than usual, as if he was allowing the information to settle before acting on it. The second officer noticed it, the slight delay, the way Hayes's eyes stayed on the road just a moment longer before turning, and he did not say anything, but the awareness was there, shared quietly between them. "We are close," the second officer added, glancing at the navigation screen, and Hayes nodded, adjusting the wheel slightly as they approached the next turn. The motion smooth, controlled, but not rushed. "Let us take a second. When we get there," Hayes said, his voice calm, and the sentence did not sound like hesitation. It sounded like intention, like something he had already decided. The second officer looked at him again, a brief glance, then nodded once, understanding without needing further explanation. Outside, the streetlights cast longer reflections across the windshield, the world shifting fully into evening now. And as they approached the address from the call, Hayes eased the car to the side of the road, not stopping abruptly, just pulling in with a controlled, deliberate motion. He left the engine running, the low hum returning, familiar now but different in the way it was held, and he sat there for a second, his hands still on the wheel, his gaze forward, taking in the scene ahead before stepping out. "Same call, different moment," he said quietly, almost to himself, and then he turned off the engine, the silence settling again, but this time it felt purposeful, not reflective of what had passed, but preparatory for what was about to begin. The second officer opened his door, stepping out onto the pavement, the sound of it closing soft but clear, and Hayes followed a second later, his movements steady, composed, but grounded in something that had shifted, something that would not be seen from the outside, but would shape everything that followed. The night air carried a slight chill, brushing against his face as he closed the door behind him, and for a moment, he stood there, looking ahead at the new situation, the new set of unknowns. And he did not rush forward, did not step into it with the same immediate certainty as before. Instead, he paused, just long enough to see, to take in what was in front of him without filling in the blanks too quickly. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he moved forward, not slower, not hesitant, but aware, and that awareness, quiet and steady, was the only thing that had truly changed, and yet it was enough to make this moment different from the last. The air felt cooler on this side of the street, the kind of quiet that came after the sun had fully stepped back and left the city under soft pools of artificial light. And Hayes slowed his pace as he approached the small gathering near the sidewalk, not stopping, not hesitating, just letting his eyes take in the scene before his presence defined it. A man stood near a parked car, his hands moving as he spoke to someone just out of view. His voice raised but not aggressive, more strained than anything else. And a woman stood a few feet away, arms folded tightly across her chest, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed somewhere between frustration and fatigue. The second officer moved slightly to Hayes's right, maintaining distance, not closing in, not asserting control, just present, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, allowing the scene to exist without interruption, without immediate interpretation. Hayes noticed the details first, the way the man's shoulders were tense but not forward, the way the woman's stance held ground but did not advance, the space between them measured in more than feet, and he let those details settle before stepping any closer. "Evening," Hayes said finally, his voice calm, even, not loud enough to cut through the moment, but steady enough to be heard, and both heads turned toward him, the shift immediate but not sharp, as if they had expected someone to arrive but were not sure how it would unfold. "We got a call about a disturbance," he continued, his tone unchanged, not assuming, not concluding, just stating the reason for his presence. And he paused there, allowing space for response instead of filling it himself. The man exhaled sharply, running a hand over the back of his neck, the motion quick, restless. "It is nothing," he said, but the strain in his voice told a different story, one that did not need to be challenged to be understood. The woman shifted her weight slightly, her arms still folded, her gaze steady. "We just had a disagreement," she added, her voice quieter but firm, and Hayes nodded once, acknowledging both statements without forcing them into a single version of events. "All right," he said, taking a small step forward, still keeping distance, still allowing space. "Let us slow it down for a second." And the words were simple, but they carried intention, not to control, but to guide the moment into something clearer. The second officer remained where he was, watching, not stepping in, not adding pressure, his presence now a support rather than a force, and the scene shifted subtly, the tension easing just enough to be felt. Hayes glanced between them, not searching for contradiction, but for understanding, and he spoke again, his voice steady, measured. "No one is in trouble here," he said, and the sentence landed softly, but it changed something, a release of expectation. A removal of the assumption that the moment needed escalation. The man's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension not gone, but reduced, and he nodded once, a small motion, while the woman's stance softened just a fraction, her arms loosening, not dropping, but no longer held as tightly. Hayes let the silence sit for a beat, giving them space to adjust, to breathe, to step back from whatever had built between them before the call was made. And in that pause, the moment began to reshape itself. Not through force, but through presence. "Tell me what happened," he said, and this time the words were not a demand, not a command, just an invitation. And the man spoke first, his voice still strained but more controlled, explaining in fragments, details that did not align perfectly but did not need to, because Hayes was not trying to piece together a single story, he was listening for understanding, for context, for the spaces between the words where meaning often lived. The woman added her side, quieter, more measured, and Hayes listened to both without interruption, without jumping ahead, without filling in the blanks, and as they spoke, the tension between them shifted, not disappearing, but becoming something that could be seen more clearly, something that could be addressed without assumption. The second officer watched, his posture relaxed but attentive, and he glanced once at Hayes, noticing the difference, the way the moment was being held, the absence of immediate judgment, the presence of something more deliberate. Hayes nodded occasionally, small acknowledgments that showed he was hearing them, not deciding for them. And when they finished, he took a breath, letting the quiet settle again, the kind of quiet that follows being heard. "Sounds like you both needed a second," he said, his tone calm, not minimizing, not dismissing, just placing the moment where it belonged. And neither of them argued, neither corrected. They simply nodded, the tension now something shared rather than opposed. Hayes stepped back slightly, giving them space again, the same space he had learned to see, and the scene, once charged, now felt different, not resolved completely, but grounded, stable in a way it had not been when he arrived. The night air moved lightly around them, carrying the distant sound of traffic, and as Hayes turned slightly, ready to step away, the moment held a quiet clarity, not because it had been controlled, but because it had been understood, and that difference, subtle but real, marked something that would carry forward, unseen but present in every step that followed. The man and the woman stood there for a moment after Hayes stepped back, the space between them no longer tight, no longer charged, just quiet, like something had been set down gently instead of forced apart. And Hayes turned slightly, giving them that space fully, not lingering where he was no longer needed, his presence shifting from center to edge without announcement. The second officer followed his movement, stepping back toward the patrol car, his posture relaxed, his eyes still aware but no longer fixed on the pair, and together they created distance without abandoning the moment, allowing it to continue without them. Hayes paused near the curb, glancing once more at the two figures behind him, noticing how their voices had lowered, how their movements had softened. Not resolved entirely, but grounded, and he gave a small nod to himself, a quiet acknowledgement that something had gone differently this time. Something had been handled with a different kind of care. The night had settled in fully now, the sky a deep shade above the streetlights that cast warm circles onto the pavement, and the faint hum of traffic carried through the air, steady, constant, like a reminder that the world did not stop. It just moved around moments like these. Hayes opened the patrol car door, the hinge giving a soft creak as he stepped in, and he did not rush, did not move with the same automatic rhythm from earlier. Instead, he sat for a second before closing the door, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel again, the quiet inside the car wrapping around him like a pause that did not need to be filled. The second officer slid into the passenger seat, adjusting slightly before looking over, his expression thoughtful, not questioning, just present in the shared understanding of what had unfolded across the last hour. "That went different," he said finally, his voice low, and Hayes nodded, his gaze still forward, watching the reflection of the streetlights stretch across the windshield. "It did," Hayes replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more than explanation could have. For a moment, they sat there without moving, the engine off, the silence steady, and Hayes let his hands fall from the wheel to his lap, the motion small, but it marked something, a release of the constant readiness that had defined the earlier moment, replaced now with something quieter, something more deliberate. His mind traced back briefly, not in detail, not replaying every word, but catching the feeling of it, the way the earlier moment had tightened too quickly, the way it had been corrected not by force, but by pause, by listening, by seeing what was actually there instead of what was assumed to be. "You see it now," the second officer said, not asking, just stating, and Hayes nodded again, slower this time. "Yeah," he said quietly, then added after a second, "You cannot unsee it once you do." And the words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just real. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the interior for a brief second before fading again, and Hayes reached forward, turning the key, the engine coming back to life with a low, steady hum that felt familiar but no longer automatic, as if each sound now carried a little more meaning than it had before. He eased the car back into motion, the tires rolling smoothly over the pavement as they pulled away from the curb, the street ahead open, quiet, lit by evenly spaced lights that stretched into the distance. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer something to fill, just something to hold, and Hayes kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady, his movements precise, but not rigid, not driven by urgency, just guided by awareness. A green light ahead flickered slightly before holding steady, and as they approached it, Hayes slowed just a fraction, not because he needed to, but because he chose to, the small adjustment reflecting something deeper than habit, something that had shifted in the way he moved through moments like this. The second officer glanced at him once more, then looked forward again, and there was no need to say anything else. the understanding already shared. As the patrol car moved through the intersection, the city opened up ahead of them, quiet streets, distant sounds, a rhythm that would carry them through the rest of the night. And Hayes kept driving, not towards something dramatic, not towards something extraordinary, just toward the next call, the next moment, the next decision. And this time, he knew he would not move the same way he had before, because earlier, in a place that looked ordinary to everyone else, something had shifted quietly, without announcement, without spectacle, and it stayed with him now, steady, unseen, but present in every mile ahead, shaping the way he saw, the way he listened, the way he chose to pause before deciding what a moment meant. And as the patrol car disappeared into the stretch of dimly lit road, the only thing that remained from what had happened was not the mistake, not the report, not even the correction, but the change, small and silent, carried forward in the way one person decided to see another before deciding what to do.